According to Ipsos polling conducted exclusively for Global News, 58% of Canadians continue to closely follow news about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That is down from 74% in March 2022. As for Canada's involvement, just over half of respondents believe our government is doing enough to support Ukraine. But roughly the same proportion say Canada cannot afford to give financial aid to Ukraine because of our country's economic situation.
When you compare Canada to other countries, it ranks near the top of the list of the countries that support our government doing something to help the Ukraine and also supporting the Ukrainian cause. But when you compare Canadians to where they were a year ago, when the war first started, those opinions have softened. So compared to other countries, pretty good, particularly countries that are not close to the conflict, where you tend to see support for Ukraine highest and support for government engagement higher, and also concern about the war higher, is in countries that are actually close, border countries, say, for example, the Nordic countries, Germany, Poland, places like that in Europe. But Canada, of countries that are further away, geographically, tends to be among the highest supporters. If you go to Latin America, for example, this is not an issue in Argentina or an issue in Chile or an issue in Colombia. So Canada sits fairly high, I would say, in the list, particularly of countries that aren't being directly affected. There's a lot of residual support here, right? So if things start to place higher in the news mix, if we start hearing more about it, particularly as we go through this anniversary. I mean, we asked people prior to the anniversary, so they haven't seen the anniversary coverage, but if that starts coming out, you probably will see these numbers move up a little bit, because there's a lot of residual support in Canada for the Ukrainian cause. What we're not seeing here is people moving from the side of saying we support Ukraine over to we support Russia. We're definitely not seeing any of that. All there is just, as the thing goes on, the emotions tend to get a little less, I would say, intense. People get more, the rational part of their brain starts to kick in a little bit, and they start to ask some questions. It's not that people have moved away from supporting the Ukraine with emphatic opinions. It's more just a drift. It's factoring in, just like we saw during the pandemic. People kind of got more used to being in that kind of situation. It's being factored in, and as a result, some other issues are starting to take more prominence in all of this. For example, the public's concerned about the cost of living and inflation. That's obviously more of an intense issue than Ukraine is at the moment. But when you go back to when the war started, Ukraine was right up there in terms of people's level of, I would say, more intense type of concern. But the other thing is, Canadians don't necessarily feel that this directly involves them. It's more of a philosophical level of support for what's going on with the Ukraine cause than it is, we've got to do this because we're next, or a sense that Canada is imperiled as a result of what's going on in Ukraine. You're really not seeing that in our numbers. It's factoring in, just like we saw during the pandemic. People kind of got more used to being in that kind of situation. It's being factored in, and as a result, some other issues are starting to take more prominence in all of this. For example, the public's concerned about the cost of living and inflation. That's obviously more of an intense issue than Ukraine is at the moment. But when you go back to when the war started, Ukraine was right up there in terms of people's level of, I would say, more intense type of concern. So one of the things that really jumps quite starkly out of the numbers is the generational divide in terms of the level of interest in what's going on in Ukraine. And it's clearly older people in the Canadian population who are more interested in what's going on, maybe because they grew up in the Cold War, maybe because they remember that. Younger people have started to move on to other issues. But I also think that there's the Cold War experience that the baby boomers grew up with, that, this harkens back to what they lived through. Anybody born before 1990, this is still, something in which the former Soviet Union, the aggressor, now obviously Russia, it reignites some of those memories, I suspect, which also gets back to the role of NATO, but also the level of concern that existed around the potential for nuclear war back then. So I think that the older population has more experience with this and it's more familiar with it. It's part more of their worldview, and it's just a rekindling of those concerns.